Candlelight catches the midnight gown first. I stand at the edge of the ballroom, and the orchestra has not yet begun. The smell of beeswax and crushed hothouse flowers fills the air so completely I can almost taste it. My hands are still. My spine is straight. Across the marble floor, through 100 candle flames and 100 turned heads, Damien Ashcroft freezes mid-sentence. He simply stops. The shadows around his chair surge forward. They move across the marble like water finding a drain, pooling toward my feet, reaching for me before he has taken a single step. The candles nearest where I stand dim without any wind to explain it. I do not flinch. I do not look away. I hold his gaze across the length of that glittering room, and I let the silence between us say everything that 7 years could not. I say nothing aloud. I do not need to. 7 years earlier, the same ballroom. I was the woman no one remembered inviting. I remember the silk first. Borrowed, 2 seasons out of fashion, the color of weak tea against skin that had never worn anything so fine. I stood near the potted palms because the palms did not judge the cut of a gown. The orchestra was tuning, that particular discord of strings finding their pitch, a sound that has always struck me as the most honest moment of any formal evening. Everything after is performance. That part, at least, is real. I held a glass of champagne I had not drunk. The room moved around me in pairs and clusters, all of them belonging to one another in ways I could not name and had never learned. I was 23 years old. I had been in London for 3 years. I had not made a single friend. Elara, Cordelia's voice arrived before she did. I recognized it by its register, that particular drop to intimacy, to whisper, that she reserved for moments when she wanted the words to land without witnesses. She materialized at my left shoulder with 2 society women at her back, both of them draped in silk that actually fit, both of them wearing the pleasant, incurious expressions of people who have never needed to be curious about anything. Cordelia's mourning brooch caught the candlelight. She had worn it for 2 years past the appropriate period. My father had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. She leaned close. Her voice fell to the register that only I could hear. "I told your father you were not suited for London," she said. "Look at you, plain as plaster." My hands shook. I pressed my thumb hard against my forefinger, the old habit, testing the texture of invisible pigment, cadmium yellow, burnt sienna. The pressure steadied something in my chest that had no name. Then her voice rose, warm and carrying, pitched for the 2 women behind her. "My stepdaughter prefers the quiet life. Don't you, Elara?" Every person within earshot turned a fraction of a degree, not enough to be obvious, enough to hear. I looked at Cordelia. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were not smiling at all. "I prefer honesty," I said, "but I see that is not on offer tonight." My voice cracked on the last word. I heard it happen. I could not stop it. The syllable split somewhere between my throat and the air, and I felt the crack as a physical thing, a seam giving way in fabric pulled too tight. I turned toward the nearest column before anyone could see my eyes burn. I stared at the plaster, and I breathed through my nose, and I pressed my thumb against my forefinger until the knuckle ached. Lord Kavanaugh stood 3 paces to my right, champagne in hand, watching the entire exchange with the mild expression of a man observing weather. He said nothing. He looked away. His name meant nothing to me then. I would learn it later, when it no longer mattered. What I did not see, what I could not have seen, facing the column as I was the shift happening across the ballroom. The candles around a tall, pale figure guttered without cause. The shadows at his feet moved in a direction that had nothing to do with the light source. He stood utterly still, the way a statue is still, the way something very old learns to be still when it does not want to be noticed. His eyes were fixed on the potted palms. On me. His name meant nothing to me then. What he was meant even less. I only knew the column was cold against my palm, and that I would not cry in this room. 3 days later, Cordelia summoned me to the morning room. The fire had been burning long enough to fill the space with coal smoke. Her bergamot tea sat cooling on the table beside her chair, untouched. Weak winter light pressed through the lace curtains and achieved nothing. I sat across from her in the chair with the worn armrest, the one that had been my father's chair before it became a chair that anyone might sit in. She did not waste time. "Your father would have wanted you settled somewhere appropriate," she said. "London is not appropriate for a girl with no prospects and no beauty to compensate." I kept my hands flat on my thighs. "My father wanted me here. You know that." Cordelia set her teacup down. No sound. The porcelain met the saucer without a click, as though she had practiced the gesture until it was soundless. She looked at me with the expression she wore for charity committees. Patient, sorrowful, entirely unmoved. "Your father is not here," she said. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire crackled. A coal shifted and sent up a brief orange flare that illuminated nothing useful. My fingernails pressed into the upholstery of the armrest. I felt the crescents forming. My gaze stayed level. My face gave nothing. "When do I leave?" I said. "Tomorrow," she said. She lifted her teacup again. The conversation, in her estimation, was complete. I sat in that chair for another 3 minutes, because I would not let her see me stand quickly. I would not let her have the satisfaction of watching me flee. I pressed my thumbnail into the worn fabric of the armrest, and I thought about cadmium yellow and burnt sienna and the particular resistance of good linen canvas, and I waited until my hands had stopped shaking before I rose. That night, I closed my trunk by candlelight. The room looked smaller with my things inside the leather case. The watercolors I had painted above the washstand remained, small studies of light through glass, a vase of dried grasses. The view from the window on a morning when the fog had been particularly beautiful. I had painted them because the walls were bare, and bare walls made me anxious. I left them because they were part of the room now, and the room was no longer mine. The stack of books on the nightstand, the single dried flower from my father's funeral, pressed inside the front cover of the top volume. I took the book, I left the flower. The reason escapes me still. Perhaps grief carried in a form I could lose was worse than grief left behind. Perhaps because I wanted to leave something of him in a house that had forgotten he existed. I pressed my hand flat against the trunk lid. The leather was cold. The paint stains on my fingers, Prussian blue along the edge of my thumb, a ghost of ochre at the first knuckle, had not fully scrubbed away. They never fully scrubbed away. "Let us see," I whispered to the empty room, "what I become without you deciding what I am." The candle flickered. Below, the front door opened. Cold air rushed up the staircase. Not the ordinary cold of a London winter, not the draft of a poorly fitted door. Something else. A cold with depth to it. A cold that had no season, that belonged to no weather I had ever stood in. The candle guttered hard, bending nearly sideways, then steadied and burned on. I heard no voices. I heard no greeting. Only the door, and then the cold, and then silence. The landing stayed dark. Whatever had entered below, I had no reason to investigate. My hand stayed flat against the leather lid of the trunk. The paint stains caught the candlelight. Below me, in the entrance hall, a man stood in the dark. A man who did not breathe, who cast a shadow that moved before he did, who had arrived at this house 3 hours too late to change what had already been decided. His name was a stranger's. His name was a stranger's. What he was, that was a stranger word entirely. The coach was waiting. The candle burned behind me. My hand pressed against the cold leather, and the paint on my fingers was the only color left in the room. Somewhere below me, the front door closed. The cold retreated. The candle steadied. I stood with my hand flat against the trunk lid and listened to the silence settle back into the house like sediment after a disturbance. Whatever had passed through that entrance hall remained nameless to me. I did not go to find out. I only knew the coach was waiting, and the morning was coming, and the paint on my fingers was the last color left in a room that had stopped being mine. The house shrank behind me. I kept my eyes forward. The first winter at Aunt Whitmore's property was the color of pewter. Everything was pewter. The sky, the stone walls, the light that came through the narrow windows and achieved nothing useful. The house sat at the edge of a village that had no opinion of me, which was the first relief I had known in years. Damp crept through the walls at night. I could hear it in the mornings, that particular cold that lives inside old stone, that has nothing to do with the weather outside and everything to do with the age of the building. I did not mind it. I had grown up in houses that performed warmth without providing it. At least this cold was honest. I planted the kitchen garden in February, when the ground was still half frozen and the effort was mostly faith. Rosemary along the south wall, sage near the gate, things that did not require much from the soil, that would come back regardless of whether anyone tended them. I needed to put my hands into something that would grow. The attic I converted by the end of that first month. It took 3 trips up the narrow stair to move the canvases I had brought in my trunk, and another 2 to carry the supply boxes. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine filled the low-ceilinged space within a day. Rain came in against the slate tiles with a sound like a brush dragged across rough paper, and I found I could work through it. I could work through most things, it turned out, as long as my hands were occupied. I painted everything I could not say. The walls filled before the first spring, landscapes first, the pewter fields, the bare hedgerows, the particular quality of coastal light that has no equivalent in London. Then the village, the women at the market with their baskets, the blacksmith's hands, the way smoke rose from the chimneys on cold mornings in a dozen different shapes, each one distinct, each one gone before I could finish recording it. I painted them anyway. The attempt was the point. I was standing at the attic window with a brush in my hand when Aunt Whitmore appeared in the doorway. She did not knock. She never knocked. She simply arrived in doorways and waited to be acknowledged, which I had come to understand was her version of courtesy. "Your stepmother writes to ask if you are recovered yet," she said. "I wrote back that you are not. I intend to keep writing that for as long as necessary." My throat tightened, not with grief, with something that had no clean name, gratitude and fury and relief all pressing against the same seam at once. My fingers found each other, thumb to forefinger, the old reflex, reaching for pigment that existed only in memory. "Thank you," I said. Aunt Whitmore looked at the paintings on the wall. Her expression did not change, but she stood there longer than she needed to. From the room below came the scratch of her pen on paper, resuming its work. The rain continued against the slate. The smell of turpentine was everywhere, and it was mine, and no one was going to take it from me. 3 years passed like that, quietly, productively, with the specific dignity of a life being rebuilt from its own materials. The teaching began because Martha Finch could not afford the parish school fees, and her mother asked if I might help. I said yes before I had finished hearing the question. By the following month, there were 6 children in the parish hall on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and by the month after that, there were 11. Purpose was too grand a word for it. It was Tuesday and Thursday. Martha was 8 years old and drew with the focused intensity of someone who had decided the world owed her a fair record. One afternoon, she held up a drawing of the manor house at the edge of the village. The proportions slightly wrong, the windows uneven, the whole thing rendered in a child's honest hand that had looked carefully and reported faithfully. "Is this good enough, Miss Whitmore?" she asked. I knelt beside her. The stone floor was cold through my skirt. Her drawing was exactly what she had seen, nothing more and nothing less, and that was worth more than technical precision. "It is exactly what you saw," I said. "That is always good enough." Martha looked at her drawing again. Something in her small face settled. My eyes stung. I turned toward the window before she could see it. The garden beyond the parish hall was blooming. Late spring, the hedgerows thick, the light warm and unhurried in the way that London light never managed to be. For the first time in 3 years, the tightness in my chest loosened by a fraction. My hands were still. The painter's habit stayed quiet. I simply breathed. The afternoon shadows outside were ordinary. They fell where the light directed them and stayed there. No cold with depth to it. No candles guttering without cause. Whatever watched in London, whatever had stood in that entrance hall on the night I left, it did not reach this far. I was beyond it. I was, for this moment, entirely my own. "You are getting better," I told Martha. "You are too," she said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to be tactful. She was not wrong. Year 5 arrived the way most years do, without announcement, without ceremony, simply as the morning after the last day of the previous one. I was in the kitchen garden deadheading the rosemary when the coach came up the lane. It bore no crest. That was the first thing I noticed. A hired coach, or one deliberately stripped of identification. The man who descended from it was somewhere past 60, with posture worn smooth by decades of ensuring other people's comfort. His coat was good. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who has learned to reveal nothing until he has assessed the room. He looked at the garden. He looked at me. He said nothing for a moment that lasted precisely as long as he needed it to. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "my name is Pemberton. I am head butler at Ashcroft Manor. My employer has asked me to deliver correspondence. He has asked every year since you departed London. I have declined every year until now." I set down the garden shears. "Who is your employer?" Pemberton looked at me, choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, for precision, not comfort. "A man who arrived at your stepmother's house 3 hours after you left it, 7 years ago," he said. "He has not forgiven himself for the delay." The rosemary smell was sharp in the warm air. A bee moved through the sage near the gate, indifferent to everything. I kept my hands at my sides. "He sent you," I said. "He did not." Pemberton reached into his coat and produced a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, the wax seals dark and unmarked. He set them on the garden wall with the deliberate care of a man placing something irreplaceable. He wrote these. He never sent them. I found them in his study and brought them without his knowledge, because a man who writes 53 letters he never sends has lost the right to decide whether they are delivered. I looked at the bundle. The seals were warm from the coach journey, the wax slightly soft at the edges. 53, I said. "I did not count them to impress you," Pemberton said. "I counted them because I needed to know how bad it was." The shadows under the garden wall deepened, not gradually, suddenly, as though something at a great distance had turned its attention in our direction. Then they settled back to ordinary afternoon shadow, and Pemberton glanced at them with the weary familiarity of a man who has spent 40 years in a house where the darkness has opinions and has long since stopped being startled by it. "Your employer," I said carefully. "What is he?" Pemberton looked at me for a long moment. "He is the Vampire King," he said, "and he has been looking for you since the night you left." The bee continued through the sage. The rosemary held its sharp, clean smell against the warm air. I stood at the garden wall with 53 unopened letters in front of me and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. The letters stayed sealed that day. I carried them to the attic studio and set them on the shelf beside the window, still tied, still sealed. I looked at them every morning for 2 years. I did not open them. Year 7 came. The letter from London arrived on a Tuesday, which meant I had 11 children waiting in the parish hall and no patience for whatever Cordelia had decided to perform. Aunt Whitmore read it aloud at the breakfast table in the flat. Voice she reserved for correspondence she found offensive. "She has not mentioned your father's name in 7 years," she said, setting the letter down. "And now she hosts a memorial. This is performance, not grief." I held the invitation. My hands were steady. No tremor. No press of thumb to finger. The cardstock was heavy, the printing precise, the whole thing designed to communicate importance to people who measured importance in cardstock and print quality. "I know what it is," I said. "I am going." Aunt Whitmore looked at me across the breakfast table. Her expression shifted through several things before settling on something that was not quite approval and not quite worry. "You are not the girl who left," she said. "No," I said. "I am not." I went upstairs to the attic studio. 7 years of paintings looked back at me. The village women with their market baskets. The coastal light in all its variations. Martha's face at 8, at 9, at 10, concentrating over her drawings with that particular ferocity. The blacksmith's hands, the pewter fields of the first winter. And in the corner, turned to face the wall, the self-portrait I had never shown anyone, painted in year 4, when I had finally looked in the mirror long enough to see someone worth recording. The bundle of 53 letters sat on the shelf beside the window, still tied, still sealed, still warm-looking, though the wax had long since hardened. I picked it up. I looked at the invitation in my right hand. I looked at the letters in my left. Behind me, 7 years of a life built from nothing but will and linseed oil and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told she was not worth remembering. My trunk sat open on the floor, half packed. I placed the letter bundle inside it, beside the book with my father's dried flower pressed between the pages. The letters stayed closed. I did not need to read them yet. I only needed to carry them back to the city where they had been written, back to the man who had written them, back to the room where the shadows moved before he did, and the candles guttered without cause. The Vampire King had been looking for me for 7 years. I intended to let him find me. London arrived before I was ready for it. The coach lurched over cobblestones and the city pressed in from all sides. Coal smoke, horse leather, the particular gray of a sky that had forgotten what open country looked like. I had not missed it. I had not let myself miss it. 7 years of telling myself that the village was enough. The children were enough. The coastal light was enough. And now here it was. The city that had watched me leave without a word of protest, and my hands were folded in my lap and perfectly still. The lodgings Aunt Whitmore arranged sat above a bookshop on a quiet square. The room was modest. A desk, a narrow bed, a window that looked onto the street below. The smell of old paper rose through the floorboards from the shop beneath, and the gas lamp hissed softly when I lit it. I set my trunk at the foot of the bed. I lifted out the bundle of 53 letters. I set them on the desk. I looked at them for a long time. Then I untied the black ribbon. The first letter was dated 7 years ago, 3 days after I left. The handwriting was controlled copperplate, each letter formed with the precision of a man accustomed to documents that mattered. He wrote that he had arrived at the house 3 hours after the coach departed. He wrote that Cordelia had met him at the door with a practiced expression of sorrow and told him I had chosen to withdraw from society for my health. He wrote that he had known, in the way he knew things that no living person could know, that she was lying. My hands shook. I set it down. I picked up the second. By the 5th letter, his handwriting had begun to change. The copperplate loosened. Letters leaned into each other. He wrote about searching the city. He wrote about the shadows in his house that would not settle after I left, that they pooled in corners and moved toward the door as if looking for something they could not name. He wrote that he had stood in the room where we had last been in the same space and found it altered in a way he could not account for by any natural law. I picked up the 10th, the 20th, the 37th. By the last letter, the script was fractured. Words pressed hard into the page, the pen nearly tearing through. He wrote, "I have lived 400 years. I have lost cities, languages, entire ways of life. None of it prepared me for losing someone I had not yet found the courage to know." I put the letter down. My eyes burned. I pressed both palms flat on the desk surface and held them there. The wood grain was smooth and cool fall under my hands. The gas lamp hissed. Below me, the bookshop went quiet as the owner locked up for the night. I listened to the bolt slide home. I listened to the footsteps recede. I kept my palms on the desk until the grain steadied me, until the burning in my eyes was something I could hold without spilling. Then I stacked the letters in order. I tied the ribbon. I set them aside. Sleep came in fragments. The following evening, I walked through Kensington Gardens at dusk because I needed air that did not smell of old paper and my own thoughts. The memorial ball was 2 days away. The path was empty. Gas lamps lined the gravel walk, their light amber and unsteady in the autumn air. The smell of crushed leaves rose from the ground with every step, metallic, cold, the particular smell of things ending. The temperature dropped, not gradually. Between one breath and the next, The air went cold enough to see. I stopped. The shadows under the nearest elm shifted, not with the wind, against it. They moved toward me, and then away, as if something were deciding. I stood on the gravel path and did not run, because I had spent 7 years learning not to run from things that frightened me, and I was not going to unlearn it now. Damien Ashcroft stepped from behind the tree line. He was exactly as I remembered, pale, still, unchanged in every particular, as though 7 years had passed for me alone and left him entirely untouched. He wore dark wool, no hat, his hands at his sides. His eyes were dark hazel. Then, as they found my face, the outer rim of the iris shifted. A slow spread of deep crimson moving inward like ink dropped into water. "You came back," he said. "I was invited," I said. "Not by me." "No." I held his gaze. "Not by you. You wrote 53 letters and sent none of them." Something moved across his face. Not an expression, exactly. More like the shadow of one. The ghost of something that had been composure and was no longer. His jaw tightened. The shadows at his feet surged toward me across the gravel, a dark tide moving fast, and then stopped. 2 feet from my shoes, as if held by a chain only he could feel. The lamppost nearest to us guttered, the flame bending sideways without any wind to move it. "You read them," he said. "Everyone." Silence. The shadows trembled at the edge of that 2-foot boundary. He stood frozen. No breath. No motion. The cold radiating from his body reached me even at this distance, like standing near an open window in deep winter. "You are not what they say you are," I said. "No," he said. "How long?" "Longer than this city has existed." The elm branches above us were perfectly still. No sound from the path. No wind. Nothing moved in the whole of that garden except the shadows at his feet, which trembled and held. My voice broke, not from fear. From 7 years of silence meeting the face I had painted from memory in a studio no one visited. The face I had tried to forget and failed. The face that had written 53 letters and decided they were not worth sending. "You could have found me," I said. "You found everything else." My eyes burned, and I did not turn away. He saw. He stood perfectly still, and the crimson in his eyes deepened, and he did not move to comfort me. He did not offer a hand or a word of softening. "I know," he said. I walked home through the cold. Pemberton arrived the following morning before I had finished my tea. He sat in the chair by the window without being invited to sit, which told me everything about the nature of his visit. His gloves were folded precisely on his knee. Morning light came through the thin curtains and made the room look provisional, temporary, like a place between places. "He did find you," Pemberton said. "Year 1. He stood outside your aunt's property for 3 nights. He watched you paint through the attic window. Then he left." I set my cup down. "Why?" "Because he decided you were safer not knowing what he was." Pemberton's voice was level, clipped, each word placed with the care of a man who had learned that imprecision caused damage. "He decided for you. That is what immortals do. They decide for the people who cannot outlive the consequences." My hands found the edge of the table. "I told him it was cowardice dressed as protection," Pemberton said. He did not disagree. He adjusted his cuffs. The gesture was automatic, precise, 40 years of service written into the movement of his hands. He looked at me. One more thing to say, deciding whether I was ready to hear it. Your stepmother did not act alone, Miss Whitmore. She had encouragement. Someone whispered to her that you would be better off away from London. Someone who believed distance would keep you safe from what he is. The room went very quiet. He encouraged my banishment, I said. He regretted it before the coach reached the city gates. Pemberton's voice did not soften. It was not the kind of voice that softened. By then it was too late. You were gone and she had sealed the house. I looked at the table surface. The wood grain was pale in the morning light. The painter's habit returned. Thumb finding forefinger, testing nothing. 7 winters compressed into that single familiar pressure. He is the vampire king, I said, and he arranged for me to disappear. Yes, Pemberton said, and then wrote 53 letters about it. Yes, and sent none of them. Also, yes. He picked up his gloves from his knee. He did not put them on. He simply held them. I did not come to defend him, Miss Whitmore. I came because you are attending the memorial ball in 2 days, and you deserve to walk into that room knowing the full shape of what happened. Not the version Cordelia tells, not the version he would tell, which would be worse because he would make it sound reasonable. I looked at him. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, Pemberton said. Attend the ball. That will be sufficient. He left. The old chair creaked as he rose. His footsteps were quiet on the stairs. The door below opened and closed, and then the square outside was ordinary again. Pigeons, cobblestones, the distant sound of a cart. I sat at the table for a long time. That night I stood in my rented room and looked at what I had brought with me from 7 years of exile. The midnight blue gown hung on the wardrobe door. I had bought it with money earned from selling paintings in the village, coastal light in all its variations, the blacksmith's hands, Martha's face at 10 with that particular ferocity of concentration. Not borrowed, not given, bought. I lifted the self-portrait from my trunk. It showed a woman with paint-stained hands and steady eyes and no apology in her posture. I had painted it in year 4, the first time the mirror showed me someone I recognized. I had never shown it to anyone. I had carried it to London because I needed to remember, when I walked into that ballroom, exactly who had made the journey. I spoke to the empty room. I was never plain, I said. I was unseen. There is a difference. The gas lamp flickered. The shadows in the corner of the room deepened, gathered, thickened, reached toward me across the floorboards. Then they receded, slowly, deliberately, as if something had heard me and chosen to withdraw. My body held. I hung the self-portrait beside the mirror. 2 versions of my face looked back at me, the reflection and the painting, the woman I was tonight, and the woman I had decided to become 4 years into an exile that was supposed to erase me. The gas lamp steadied. My hands were still. No tremor, no press of thumb to finger. The letters sat on the desk, tied and read and set aside. The midnight blue gown hung ready on the door. Tomorrow I would carry the self-portrait into the room where it had all begun, and every person who had watched me leave without a word would see exactly what I had become in their absence. The midnight blue gown was heavier than I remembered when I lifted it from the wardrobe door. Not the fabric. The weight of what I was carrying it toward. I tucked the self-portrait under my arm. The frame was plain wood, unvarnished, I had made it myself in the 3rd year of exile, learning the craft from a carpenter in the village who said I had steady hands. I had not told him why steadiness mattered to me. I simply learned. The night air outside was cold and sharp. Beeswax candles burned in every window of the house as I approached. Hothouse flowers banked the entrance. White roses, forced into bloom out of season, their scent too sweet for November. The same orchestra I remembered from 7 years ago played inside. A different piece. Slower, as if even the music had grown cautious. I walked through the front door. The ballroom had not changed. The same chandelier, the same pale marble floor, the same arrangement of society standing in careful clusters, performing the correct version of grief. And then the room went quiet. Not all at once. In a wave from the entrance outward, as recognition moved through the guests like a current. Lord Kavanaugh saw me first. He was standing near the fireplace with a champagne glass in his hand. He had been there 7 years ago when Cordelia whispered her verdict over me and the room pretended not to hear. He had said nothing then. He looked at me now with the expression of a man who understood, suddenly, that silence has a cost. "Miss Whitmore?" he said. "Lord Kavanaugh." I met his eyes without effort. "You look exactly as I remember." He flinched. The champagne glass shifted in his grip. Recovery was his problem, not mine. I walked toward the display table at the far end of the room, where Cordelia had arranged photographs of my father in silver frames. She had placed them with the precision of a woman who understood that grief, properly staged, is a form of ownership. My father's face looked out from a dozen angles. None of them showed the man who had told me, at age 9, that a painting was more honest than a mirror. I set the self-portrait among the photographs. The woman in the painting looked back at the room with paint-stained hands and no apology in her posture. I had spent 4 years learning to paint that expression. Not defiance, not performance, simply presence. My father always said the best memorial is the truth, I said. My voice carried. I made sure of it. So here is mine. The nearest 20 guests heard every word. I watched their faces recalibrate. I watched them see me, not the woman Cordelia had described, not the one who had chosen to withdraw, not the plain and forgettable daughter of a man they had admired. They saw the woman who had come back. Cordelia appeared at my left shoulder. She moved the way she always moved, smooth, controlled, her mourning brooch catching the candlelight. She had worn that brooch for 7 years, past its proper season. It was a weapon disguised as sentiment. Her voice dropped to its familiar whisper, the register she reserved for cruelty. "What do you think you are doing? This is my event. My house, my husband's memory." I turned to face her fully. Why voice carried. I made sure of it. "Your husband left this house to me in his will," I said. "You know that. Mr. Pemberton delivered the documents this morning." Cordelia's face drained. The color left it so completely that her mourning jewelry looked garish against the sudden pallor. She looked toward the doorway. Pemberton stood there, gloves in hand, expression unreadable. He nodded once. "You have no right," she began. "I have every right," I said. "I have had it for 7 years. You simply hoped I would never return to claim it." The whisper that had protected her was gone. The room was listening. Every careful cluster of society guests had turned, and there was no version of this moment that Cordelia could reshape into something manageable. The narrative she had maintained for 7 years, The story of a daughter who chose to withdraw, who preferred the country, who was simply not suited to London, collapsed in the silence that followed my words. Cordelia retreated, not gracefully. She moved toward the far corner of the room, and the guests near her shifted, almost imperceptibly, away. Pemberton approached me a few minutes later. He adjusted his cuffs. The gesture was automatic, precise, the same movement I had watched him make at my aunt's kitchen table 2 mornings ago. "Your father would have been proud, Miss Whitmore," he said. "He told me once, the year before he passed, that you were the only honest person in this house." My throat tightened. I felt it as a physical thing, a pressure behind the sternum, a sudden awareness of my own breathing. I pressed my thumb against my forefinger, the old painter's habit, testing the texture of nothing. Then I stopped. I set my hand flat at my side. I did not need it. "Thank you, Pemberton," I said, "for the letters, for the documents, for telling me the truth when no one else would. I serve the house, Miss Whitmore." His voice did not waver. His eyes were bright. "You are the house." The grandfather clock marked the quarter hour. Champagne glasses clinked somewhere behind me. The orchestra played on, and I could hear the guests beginning to murmur. The particular sound of a room recalibrating its understanding of who held authority in it. Then the temperature dropped. It happened between one breath and the next. Not a draft. Not the door opening. A fundamental shift in the air, as if the room had exhaled something warm and drawn in something older. Every candle in the chandelier dimmed at once. The shadows at the entrance gathered and thickened and poured forward like a tide ahead of a ship. Damien Ashcroft walked into the ballroom. Some guests stepped back. Some pulled their shawls tighter. None of them could have named what changed when he entered, but every person in the room felt it. He was dressed in black, as always. His eyes were full crimson, no hazel rim remaining. He let them see. No lowered gaze, no angle of concealment against the candlelight. He walked directly to where I stood beside the self-portrait. He stopped. The room held its breath. "I am what the old stories call the vampire king," he said. His voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner of the room. "I have lived 4 centuries in this city. I have watched it burn and rebuild and forget." He looked at me, only at me. "I have never forgotten her." No one moved. Lord Kavanaugh's champagne glass trembled visibly in his hand. Somewhere near the fireplace, a woman made a small sound and was immediately silent. Damien's crimson eyes did not leave my face. "You were never plain," he said. "You were the only thing in this room that was real. I failed you 7 years ago. I will not ask forgiveness. I am asking you to let me begin earning it." The shadows at his feet settled. The candles steadied all at once, as if they had been waiting for permission. The room remained silent. An immortal had spoken his nature aloud in a London ballroom, and the silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a room that had just understood something it could not unknow. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of the attic window and the 3 nights he had stood outside in the dark, watching me paint, and then left. I thought of 53 letters written and folded and tied with black ribbon and never sent. I thought of Pemberton's voice at my aunt's kitchen table. "He decided for you." I thought of 7 winters and coastal light and Martha's face at 10 with that particular ferocity of concentration, and the self-portrait I had painted in year 4 when I had finally looked in the mirror long enough to see someone worth recording. I did not come back for you, I said. I came back for myself. I paused. The room waited. But I read every letter, I said, and I brought them with me. I reached into the fold of my gown. The black ribbon was there, smooth and cool against my fingers. I had carried it against my side all evening, through the entrance and the confrontation, and Pemberton's bright eyes and all of it. I held it out. We begin as equals, I said, or we do not begin. He took the ribbon. His fingers were cold, careful, precise. They closed around the ribbon and around the edge of my hand for one moment, and I did not pull away. I turned to face the room. The guests parted. Not because I asked them to, because the woman who had been called plain and sent away and erased from the narrative of this house was standing in the center of it, and the space around her had changed. I walked toward the garden doors. Behind me, 2 steps back, I heard his footfall. Quiet, deliberate, following. On the display table, the self-portrait caught the candlelight. The paint-stained hands in the painting seemed to glow, warm and golden and steady, the hands of a woman who had made something true in the years they had tried to make her disappear. The black ribbon rested in his closed fist.